picture of what we're doing with the fair study and equity analysis, right? I don't know. Doug's got to correct me in terms of the name of this. We got to find a better name, actually, probably. But basically, what's been happening, and I know that you've probably heard this too. We've been getting a lot of feedback on fairs over the past year. We did the N-line fair pilot, which ended in March, and there was a real, concern, particularly from those up north, about not being able to continue that. So Deborah, coming in, last November, was looking at our fare structure and said, this is kind of complicated, and so I really would like to take a comprehensive look at it. So what we have outlined, and Doug and I and others have been involved in developing kind of a plan to move forward. So what we've essentially done is said, okay, first of all, we need to step back and do a comprehensive look at this. We don't want to continue to do pilots, because with the N-line pilot, it was a 6-month pilot, and the way that the rules work with FTA is if you do a fare change for less than 6 months, you do not need to do a fare equity analysis, meaning you not need to look in terms of the impact of that fare change on minority and low-income populations. So we promised that to the N-line folks. We did that, but then we got to the end and said we can't extend it. So what we've said, their approach with this fare study is that we're going to take a step back and do more, what I call more of a traditional approach, similar to what we did in 2015, but a combination of 2015 and 2018. For those of you who remember the past program working group, is we want to both address our fare structure and our past programs. So as we've gotten comments on both, so what we are doing and what our plan is over the next couple months, and you guys are getting a preview, is that we will be going out to stakeholders, and I think I talked to Roger either this next month or July, but probably next month. We'll come back to you with a little bit more formal presentation and allowing you to give us some feedback on your current perspectives on our fare structure and past programs. The idea with this engagement that we're going to be doing this summer in July or June and July is that would inform a scope of work that we would release in the early fall for a consultant to get on board to kind of help us lead us through a comprehensive fare study and equity analysis. So that essentially will happen in the fall, and then by the end of the year, we would hope to have somebody on board and then start in earnest really next year. The expectation is that this is not going to be a real quick process. We're saying a minimum of 18 months to complete it. I know some people are not happy about that. They'd like to have us done sooner, but given the nature of what we need to do, and also the nature of the direction that we've gotten from FTA on having a robust outreach process, making sure that we do a fair equity analysis, and making sure that we have good data. That's another piece of this, because the data that we currently have is a little old. It's 2015, and it's ridership information. And also, we're kind of in the middle of COVID, so we actually want to let this play out a little bit. So ideally for us, it would be advantageous to collect some of the data on ridership and fares early next year. So that's the idea. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell in terms of what the plan is. So like I said, we're just starting. The expectation is that we'll come back to you all with a more formalized presentation next month, possibly July, but hopefully next month, with some specific questions that we want to ask about your feedback on our current fare structure. So with that, I will end and open it up for any questions from anybody.
I have a question, Bill. I'm curious about what other communities are doing for fare structure when they have a transit agency about the size of ours or similar. Is there a way we can get access to that?
Well, one of the things that we have in the scope is to do a peer review of other agencies and what they're doing. What I can say is, because we have gotten the question about what are other transit agencies doing in response to COVID. Some agencies, like we did for a brief period last summer, suspended fares. But I haven't seen, and I don't know, Doug, if you've seen anything where we've seen an agency that's actually lowered fares as a result of COVID. So we're, approaching this kind of like more so kind of outside of COVID, I would say, in terms of looking at our fare structure long term, because I think there has been some suggestions made that we should look at a kind of another pilot, to reduce fares right away. And the concern that we had, and Deborah expressed this earlier, is that if we do, it could be another pilot situation where we do it for 6 months and then we have to go back to the way things were. And so we think it's better to kind of bite the bullet and do this more comprehensive approach.
I think it would be helpful, at least from my viewpoint, to see more generally what the fare structures are elsewhere. It's fine to get some acknowledgement of how everyone responded to COVID, but it's sort of like after COVID would be useful.
Right.
And
Right.
I do believe some patterns will change in terms of ridership. So maybe going to what was done before COVID isn't quite the right answer either. It's challenging.
Yep.
I just went to a fascinating workshop put on by Next City titled Transit Equity. And one of their main points was to include from the very beginning the people that you want to have the equity. And it was a consultant who did a study for for a pricing during rush hours. And they hired a consultant that immediately asked for people from the community. And what struck me as really interesting was they offered to pay the people something for the time they spent on the committee. And they said they got really, really good information that way, having the people that they needed to serve be members of the committee. And they had 3 points. And what I probably should do is send you their PowerPoint. They said it'll be out. It was pretty self-explanatory about how they went out in the community and found people that were willing to serve on this committee. And they were the ones who helped create the questions that were asked in the surveys, so that it was language that the people understood and could answer.
Yeah.
But it was an excellent workshop.
And funny you mentioned that, because we've actually, as part of the scope, our plan is to do an extensive outreach into what I'll call marginalized communities, population of marginalized communities. And Carl Green, which I don't know if Carl's come to this committee yet, who's our new Title VI manager, or a transit equity manager, excuse me. And he's kind of leading that. He's got the experience. He worked in Portland for TriMet, where they did something similar and worked a lot through, community-based organizations to get some of that community feedback. And so we are looking to use that model as part of this fare study.
Thank you.
Okay,
Hi,
Bill, is there a kind of a template that comes from the feds on doing work like this?
Well, they have guidance for anytime you do a fare change. Couple of the key things are doing, a robust outreach process and doing a fair equity analysis for any permanent change, which permanent change is defined as anything that over 6 months, that lasts over 6 months. So those are two kind of primary tenets that we are looking to do. The other things that they give guidance on is a type of data that you should collect, and we're going to try to work with them, because we're going to be challenged on that front, because one, we've got, like we said, we've got this new haven't settled into a new pattern yet, and we really need to do that for us to have useful data. So we're crossing our fingers that by early next year that we'll be in more of a normalized, maybe it's a new normal, but normalized pattern.
And will you collect data like Reimagine has done for, 19 and 2019 and all, using, cell phone stuff, and are you going to use
You
that
know,
kind of stuff?
possibly. I don't know yet. I mean, a lot of it I think is going to get, we're going to hopefully get some innovative ideas from consultants, because one of the things that we're very conscious of is everybody's anxious for this fair study to get over with so that the fair change can happen. Traditionally, if you do these kinds of survey information, it takes a pretty long period of time.
Right.
I think the last time we did it in 2015, it took us over a year to collect the data. We don't want to do that. So we're looking for innovative ideas with the consultants that we get to bid on this.
Great.
Well, I think you just mostly answered my question. I mean, this is not just a data issue, obviously, there's a lot of policy involved too, but it is good to have some underlying information that you base decisions on. And I don't mean this to sound like it might come out, but I don't think RTD has ever done a terribly good job of collecting ridership data for various reasons. I mean, it's partly because we have a system where all riders don't have to use, electronic cards. And obviously on the rail lines, it's the honor system, and, on and on and on. Okay, fine. Those were decisions we made. It just makes this more difficult. So yeah, I think understanding better how you're going to collect that would be really, it's fine to have a consultant who's done it elsewhere look at it. That's great, because I don't have any brilliant ideas. But I think the other piece of the puzzle, of course, is what about all the people who don't use the system because it isn't useful to them in some way, which could be location, but it also could be scheduling, and it obviously could be fares. How do you incorporate them? Because they're not in your ridership data, of course, because they ride the system. And that is difficult. I don't know what other cities have done, but I think we need to think about that as well. And the last comment, and you've mentioned this a few times, is I don't know when post-COVID's going to settle down. I don't think anybody does. I'd be surprised if it's as early next year. And so you might just have to do some averaging of post and honestly call it good enough, because it probably will be good enough. It will take years for it, the new normal, whatever the heck that means, to settle in, both in terms of people's patterns of travel and what businesses do, and what offices do, and on and on and on. So yeah, it's the timing could be better. That perspective, go ahead and do it. It needs to be done, but yeah, it's an interesting issue. One other policy thing I'd love you to look at. Some people may jump at this, I don't know, but in terms of other communities that do give reduced fares for low-income people or whatever the categories are, it'd be very helpful to know where some of that funding comes from. I've always thought RTD is unusual in the sense that we don't get state funding, essentially. It's in the noise, we get so little of it. And I think for a lot of other states, their main transit agencies do get some additional statewide funding, which arguably then can help provide this funding for lower income people, which frankly strikes me as a statewide issue, not just an issue of the region that provides the transit. So I think some more of that would be useful in the peer analysis if possible.
Sure. And I've done a little bit of research on that myself, and I know that in a lot of cases, and I know David's on the line, so hopefully he's he can close his ears, that a lot of times it is the local jurisdictions that do contribute. I know in the case of New York, they put a sizable amount, their council put a sizable amount in to pay for their low income program. So there is that kind of out there. I think that we took the approach that we're going to absorb it in other ways. And certainly we can relook at that as we move forward next year.
Could I ask that when you send out the RFP that you include it's co-census with a colon between the co and the census, just the word census.
Sure.
And I mean, it may not work for them at all, but I was just so impressed with the program.
Bill, could I ask, does the FAIR study also include other sources of revenue from riders, such as like parking fees? Because part of it, I'll say like the regional fare structure, like it charges more for the bus fare, but then parking is free at park and rides for the first day. And like, has RTD ever really put those together to consider how they both should fit together? And maybe the change should be parking related versus the actual fare for riders and stuff like that.
And we have gotten that suggestion, and we have done some research in the past. We did do a parking pricing technical assessment a few years ago, but Reimagine is really going to be the one that's going to be addressing that. We're starting that process right now. So we're going to be looking at that, and we'll be coordinating obviously with the FAIR study between the two. But I think Reimagine will probably address the parking issue a little bit more. And then in terms of some of those results, I think the timing will work out hopefully well, that it'll just be able to be folded into the FAIR study.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Does that new transportation bill include the possibility of allowing for charging for parking? Because
Yes.
that's a big issue.
Yes. So we the bill, and I don't know. Have you heard, Doug? I don't know if it's been signed by the governor yet, but it's on his desk, I believe. And if he signs it, then we would have the ability to charge anywhere and without any regulation that we currently have.
Excellent.
All right. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, guys, and I'll probably see you next month. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Matt, do you want to take the next one?
Oh, sure. Although, Doug, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. As you may know, first of all, this committee has a number of new people on it. And secondly, bubbled up from our conversations is that I think all of us would like to better understand the finances. We don't need to be experts in it. And unfortunately, I don't think we have any solutions to some of the problems or any contributions to make in a monetary sense. But, like any group, we, of course, wish we could do all sorts of great things. And in order to do them, we just need to have a better understanding of the fundamentals of the financing, especially, post-COVID, although that's a little bit of a black hole right now. And so we really appreciate you coming. I'm sure we'll have a whole bunch of questions for you, which is why we've allocated, at least an hour or so. So if you would just quickly introduce yourself, that would be great, and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And thank you for having me this afternoon. And thank you all for serving on this committee. It's very valuable to RTD. My name is Doug McLeod, and I am the Chief Financial Officer at RTD. Been with RTD 11 years now. So been with RTD for a while. I have a little bit of knowledge about the history and how we've gotten to where we are with some of our finances. And Roger and I, through Roger's guidance, we put together a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation to kind of walk through some of the numbers, just to give you an idea of how we operate our finances at RTD. I plan to go through that, and then certainly I won't be able to see your faces probably while the presentation is up. So please just jump right in and ask me questions or make comments anytime. All right, I'll attempt to share my screen here. All right. So I'm trying to put it into slide mode and it's not working. There we go. Hopefully you can see that okay.
Looks good.
All right, thank you. All right, so just kind of some basics is what I want to walk through this afternoon about how we do things from the financial standpoint at RTD. So at RTD, you've heard of the base system and fast tracks. So we actually have two legal entities, so to speak, within RTD framework. So the base system has existed since 1969. And the base system really encompasses all of our bus, with the exception of some of the BRT, bus rapid transit going up US 36. So it's all of our bus and our ADA and flex ride services. And then it includes most of our light rail with certain exceptions. And then in 2004, the voters authorized RTD to increase our tax, our sales and use tax from 0.6% that we have on the base system by another 0.4. And that was deemed fast tracks. That was for obviously the fast tracks build out and then to continue the operations of fast tracks once it was built out. So we do have to keep those two pieces separate because the voters authorized fast tracks while the base system was already authorized in terms of us collecting that tax. So we can actually spend base system money on fast tracks, but we cannot spend fast tracks money on the base system. So we do keep those pieces separate for accounting and reporting purposes. So just to give you an idea of our funding sources that we have at RTD, our biggest funding source, it makes up about 2/3 of our revenues, is our sales and use tax. So that 0.6 plus 0.4 or a total of 1%. Sales taxes get collected on mainly on goods, not on services within the district, the 8-county district of RTD. We also collect sales taxes from internet sales, and that's been very helpful to us, especially lately, because during COVID, so many people are staying home and ordering things from Amazon and elsewhere that we actually get to participate in sales tax collections there. Passenger fares are our fees that you're all aware of. We just got done speaking about that. Our fares make up about 15% of our total revenue, and I'll have a slide, I believe, later that kind of breaks down these pieces in percentage terms. But passenger fares is a significant amount of revenue for us, even though it's only 15%. It's back in 2019, it was about $150 million. And I'll talk a little bit later about what COVID has done to each one of these funding sources. Then moving on, we have federal and local assistance, and that's broken down between grants, mainly from the Federal Transit Administration. So in a typical year, we'll get about $80 million in operating grants, and those are called preventive maintenance grants. That's just to help us maintain our fixed guideway systems. We also get one-time capital grants. So we got a $1.03 billion capital grant to build out the Eagle project, which is the A, B, and G line on fast tracks. So we get those when we apply for those. So those are just periodic and meant mainly for infrastructure. We accept contributions, even though we don't get contributions other than local contributions. Oftentimes when we build a new rail line, we'll ask for local contributions of 2.5% so that the local municipalities have skin in the game. And I think probably one of our most successful ones was with the Southeast Rail Extension, where the city of Lone Tree, developers, et cetera, put in about 35 million of that $260 million project, I believe it was. And then, of course, we also occasionally have access to federal loans. You'll hear about the TIFIA loan occasionally. I believe that stands for Transportation Infrastructure Financing and Innovation Act. So occasionally the government will make loan programs available as well. One of our big issues, or one of our big funding sources for infrastructure projects in addition to grants, is debt financing. So we will go out to the markets and issue bonds, just like many government agencies. Our bonds, however, are not general obligation bonds. They're actually guaranteed by sales and use tax revenue. So when we issue those bonds take precedence over any other spending that we do. So sales and use taxes first go to pay the debt service on the bonds. And I'll talk a little bit more about bonds later, but we have a significant amount of debt because of all the fast tracks build outs. The acronym COPS stands for Certificates of Participation. That is a lease purchase agreement. So bonds are actually subject to taper. We have to get voter approval to issue new debt. So if we want to issue new bonds, we have to go to the voters. Certificates of participation are somewhat like debt, but they're, instead of being collateralized by sales and use taxes, they're actually collateralized by the underlying asset. So we will issue certificates of participation to purchase rolling stock, for instance. So our rolling stock is our buses and trains. Then if we default on the payment, the bank can come take away our buses and our trains. So similar to a lease with a car. Those have been deemed by the Colorado Supreme Court not to be subject to taper, so we do not need voter approval for issuing COPS. However, we do need to consider our ability to pay for them if we do borrow the money. And then we've got several other smaller sources of revenue over there on the right under other. We spoke about parking, advertising, naming rights. We do get some funding from that with all the wraps that we have on our buses and trains. We also have some agreements like with the University of Colorado naming rights for the A-line. So we're always looking for other opportunities to raise funding. So those are our funding sources. All right, funding uses. So we generally break down the uses of our funds into 3 different categories: operating expenses, non-operating, and then of course, capital expenditures. So you can see on the left side there are operating expenses. And by the way, our total, in a normal year in 2019, our total revenues and our total expenses balance. So we basically spend everything that we bring in on these items that you see here. And our total budget is about $1 billion with a B dollars, both on the expenditure side as well as on the revenue side. So a fairly sizable operation we have going. Just a couple things to point out on operating expenses. Salaries and wages are probably our largest expense, along with benefits. We're in the people business, people moving people. So we have a lot of employees and a lot of costs associated with that. That's on the operating side. We also have capital expenditures, which are huge too. I'll get to in a second. The other item that may not look familiar in that list is purchase transportation. So the legislation that was previously discussed that's waiting for the governor to sign, prior to this legislation being signed by the governor, RTD was limited to contracting out up to 58% of its services. With this new legislation, it takes away that limit. So purchase transportation is when RTD goes out and contracts with a third-party private company to provide services. So we have several, all of our paratransit ADA services that we call Access-a-Ride are contracted out. So our Flex Ride and some of our fixed route bus services. And then the biggest one, single contract that we probably have, I mean, bus altogether is big, but we have our contract with Denver Transit Operators to operate the A, B, and G lines. That's what we call purchase transportation, because we're purchasing the services of a third-party contractor to provide those services. What we've found in the past when we've done analysis is it's cheaper for us to do purchase transportation in certain instances than hire our own employees. Not a huge difference, but enough of a difference that it makes it worthwhile for RTD. Some of the items that we classify as non-operating expenses. So I should back up and say that when we look at our operating expenses, we also look at fares, because fares are used to pay for those operating expenses, but they're not nearly enough to pay for the operating expenses. So you hear a term called fare recovery ratio. What that fare recovery ratio is referring to is if you take the total of our fares collected and then compare that to the total of our operating expenses, it's usually in the range of about 18% to 20% for RTD. So only 18 to 20% of our expenses to provide operations are covered by our fares. Hence the need for sales and use taxes, grants, and some of those other items. So we look at what it costs on an operating basis. Then we also have non-operating expenses. That's interest expense to pay our bonds and our certificates of participation, as well as the principal payments on that debt. Occasionally we'll get some other things. Maybe it's a building or something that's not used for operations. And then our other big item is capital expenditures. Capital expenditures, you'll hear it referred to as CapEx, fixed assets, other terms, but as opposed to just ongoing day-to-day costs, these capital expenditures are one-time expenditures, say for anything that has a useful life of over 1 year. So that would include buildings, land, infrastructure, like our rail system, vehicles and equipment. So those are kind of one-time purchases that we do periodically. Of course, we have to maintain them and replace them, but they're not incurred each month, for instance. So that's what CapEx refers to. So just moving on to the financial framework of RTD. There's a lot of parameters of which we're subject to at RTD that kind of constrain some of our ability to do certain things. We talked about with the fares that the FTA has certain requirements based on the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VI, and what we can do in terms of setting our fares. But some of the agencies that are involved with RTD and what we can and can't do are regulatory agencies like Federal Transit Administration, Federal Railroad Administration, Internal Revenue Service, Public Utilities Commission, and then there's a few others as well, but those are the big ones. We also are subject to legislation, just like the bill we spoke about earlier. So legislation obviously affects RTD. We're considered a subdivision of the state. So the state has oversight over RTD to a certain extent, and we are subject to reviews and audits. We just completed a state performance audit last year at the end of 2020. We also have our RTD board policies. We have internal policies and procedures. It's obviously a lot of political considerations to take into account because we are responsible to taxpayers and our constituents. And then we also have intergovernmental agreements. You'll hear them referred to as IGAs, where we make an agreement with another government agency to do certain things. We have contracts and then ethical and fiduciary responsibilities, and as well as we're subject to appropriation of funding. So we do have pretty strict budgetary controls at RTD. The RTD Board of Directors has to approve any spending that we do, and we do that through a process once a year that we call the budget, the annual budget, where we go to the board and we ask them for permission to appropriate a certain amount of funding that we have determined that we will need for the next year. So those budgetary controls that we have in place is once the board approves those appropriations, we cannot deviate from that without going back to the board and asking for more money or to move money. So it has to be for specific purposes that they appropriated, and it cannot exceed a certain amount. I'll go through this one really quickly, but I mentioned that our sales and use taxes first go to pay our debt service before it can be used for operations and other things. So what happens is the Colorado Department of Revenue collects the taxes, sales taxes for us at RTD. And what happens to those monies each month before they send them over to RTD is they send them to a trustee, happens to be Bank of New York Mellon. BNY takes out enough of those monthly sales tax remittances and puts them in an escrow account, and it's enough to finance 1 month worth of debt service. So before RTD even receives our sales and use taxes, the necessary funding to pay that debt service for that month is put into an escrow account. Then once BNY takes that money out, they send the difference back to RTD to use for our other purposes. And the flow of funds over there on the right is just a basic flow of funds and how they are applied towards bonds. Why that's important is that certain bonds and certain debt have priority in getting paid over others. And obviously, just like with your house or your car, you want to make sure you pay your debt or you will never borrow again. So that's why we pay things first. Sales tax bonds on the base system get paid first, followed by the other items below. And you can see in the dark blue box down there towards the bottom is the debt service gets taken out before we can appropriate expenses for operations. Just a couple more items here on our budget formulation. You'll hear different terms that we use. So we talk about the annual budget. That is a one-year appropriation of funding. So we come together in the October timeframe and present a preliminary budget to the public and the board for consideration for the following year. And by the way, we operate on a calendar fiscal year. So everything we do fiscally is from January through December. Many other agencies like the state actually operate on a July to June basis. So we're a little different than them in the federal government in that respect. But we bring in an adopted budget that we ask permission for the following year in the October timeframe as a draft. And then we need the board to appropriate or approve that budget no later than December 31st. And we usually ask them for appropriation in November. So that's the one-year budget that we put in place, and we control our spending using that budget. We also have two forecasts. One you'll hear is called the Midterm Financial Plan, often referred to as the MTFP. That is a 6-year plan. And what we're trying to do with that is forecast out, rather than just looking only at the budget, which is 1 year, we want to know what our other obligations and what the outlook is for our finances past 1 year. So that midterm financial plan is a 6-year plan. It includes the first year as the budget and then 5 additional years. It helps us a lot in planning for increases in expenditures, forecasting revenue, and also replacement of assets. So if we're going to buy a bus, a 40-foot bus typically has a useful life of about 12 years. We need to know when that 12th year is coming up so that we can plan to replace it and make the expenditure. And finally, we have a 30-year plan that's called the Long Range Financial Plan. I should mention that the Midterm Financial Plan, we update that once a year as well as the budget. Long Range Financial Plan, we typically update every other year, sometimes every year. We skipped a year due to COVID, but each one of these builds on each other. So we have a 1 year with the adopted budget, another 5 years on top of that for a 6-year midterm financial plan. Then we have another 24 years to get to a 30-year plan. This is necessary for the for DRCOG, the Denver Regional Council of Governments, because when they do their transportation planning for the entire area, they have to take into consideration what is CDOT's plan for roads, what is RTD's plan for transportation, and then local municipalities too. So this whole plan comes together in a 30-year plan to help with planning for the future and how we provide services and roads. I mentioned that we have a balanced budget policy whereby we have a projection of how much funding we will collect, and based on that, that's the budget that we take to the board. So if we anticipate that we will collect $1 billion in a normal year in revenue, then we take an appropriation to the board of $1 billion. We also try to set aside a little bit into reserves, because with sales and use tax making up 2/3 of our revenues, we're very susceptible to economic swings. Anytime there's a recession, a pandemic, things like that, we see a dip in our revenues. And if we're working on a balanced budget policy where we're spending everything that we project to bring in, if we've appropriated $1 billion and our revenues come in at $950 million, we need some kind of reserves of about $50 million to balance that out. So we call it reserves, funds, other things like that, it's like a savings account, a rainy day fund. So just a little bit more on the budget here. This is, it's required by the state of Colorado that we adopt a budget by each year by December 31st. If that budget is not adopted, we can only spend up to 90% of the prior year appropriations until a budget is adopted. So we make sure that we get our budget to our board of directors and get it approved before the end of the year. The appropriation is for 1 year, obviously, because the budget is for 1 year, and then we'd go back to them the following October and November and ask them for the following year's appropriation. More on the midterm financial plan. Again, this just provides guidance going forward for a forecast. It also helps guide us in developing the budget because we look, so if we're developing a budget for the current year, we would need to know what the needs are for the next year as well as the following 4 to 5 years, just so we can kind of plan out what our cash flows are and when we will need money. And then the long range financial plan, already spoke to this. Oh, the other, in addition to Dr. Cog needing the information, we have credit rating agencies. We actually use 3 different rating agencies that rate our debt and our ability to repay our debt. We use Standard & Poor's, we use Fitch and Moody's. So they look at our debt, they look at our long range plan, and then they give us credit ratings on each one of our tranches of debt. So if we need to go out and issue new debt, they'll give us an investment credit rating or something else if they don't think we have a great chance of repaying our debt. So that's an important aspect of our ability to generate funds as well. So that's kind of a quick summary of how things work at RTD regarding finances. And I'm going to spend a few more minutes going into a few slides about what's going on currently with our finances, especially with COVID-19. But maybe I'll pause there and see if there are any questions.
Yes, Doug, this is Joe Lamers. I have a question. You talked about how you need to go to the voters to get approval to issue bonds. That bonding authority, I think, is going to come up in the midterm future here. What's the strategy for extending that or getting it reapproved or whatever?
Yeah, great question, Joe. And that's true. And that is the result, the voter authority is the result of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights that was issued in 1992. So for instance, well, we have the 2 pieces. We have the system, and then we have fast tracks. When the voters approved fast tracks for the 4/10 sales tax, they also approved a certain amount of debt that we could borrow. I believe the numbers were just over $2 billion in principal, total repayment of, I think it was $7 billion. So when you take principal and interest, $7 billion. And the provision of that was that we cannot borrow more than that. We are exempt from TABOR limitations until that fast tracks debt is paid off. And when I say TABOR limitations, some of the provisions of TABOR also require that revenue collections not exceed prior year revenue collections for a government agency above a certain amount. So in the case of RTD, once we're subject to TABOR, once our debt is paid off on fast tracks, we will be subject to TABOR. Right now, we're considered to have a TABOR exemption from the revenue limitations until that debt is paid off. And what that means is there's a ratchet down effect, it's called. So if in this year we collect $1 billion in revenue, and then next year we collect $950 billion of revenue, the following year we cannot collect more than $950 billion plus the increase in population and property tax values. For some agencies, it's not property tax values, it's inflation. But let's say it's a 3% increase. So we would not be able to collect in the following year more than $950 billion plus 3%. Right now, we're not subject to that. So in the case of fast tracks, we won't be subject to that TABOR ratchet down impact until 2050, 2050, when all the fast tracks debt is paid off. So that's not an immediate concern. To your point, Joe, where we have the more immediate concern is on the base system. The base system bonds that were borrowed pre-TABOR are now subject to TABOR and the ratchet down. So Those bonds are scheduled to be paid off, and they were issued in about $500 million was issued to build the Southeast Rail and part of the Southwest and Central Corridor. Those bonds will be paid off in 2024. After that, after 2024, we'll be subject on the base system, the 6/10 to ratcheting down. So technically, anytime we have a recession, we get a new baseline and we can't collect more than that certain amount of money. If we do, then we have to return that excess to the taxpayers. So it kind of limits our ability to grow our sales taxes to population plus property tax growth.
Thank you.
Great question. Yeah. So that's definitely something that we don't know how to forecast at this time, but it's definitely on our radar that, when we look at our midterm financial plan for the base system, the base system's in pretty good shape in terms of generating additional funding, but we don't know what that Tabor impact is going to be, and it could limit that 6-year and 30-year plan to being less than what we show currently.
I've got a couple of questions.
Sure, Matt.
One, and I've known this, but it's a little odd that fast tracks can't subsidize the base system, but the base system can subsidize fast tracks. All right, that's the way it worked out. Does it? I mean, both historically and currently, is the base system implicitly or explicitly subsidizing fast tracks? And is that the way it's just going to be for a while?
Not currently, however, that may occur in the future. Fast tracks, because it was primarily a capital expansion program up until basically last year when the final funded portion of fast tracks was opened with the N line. There wasn't a whole lot of their funding going towards operations, and we had deferred a lot of the debt payments. So on all the money that fast tracks borrowed to do the build out, a lot of the debt service that we've been doing along the way was mainly paying interest on that debt. So it'd be like paying the interest on your credit card, but not paying down the balance. But the way that debt is structured is starting this year and next year, as we start to actually pay more than just the interest, we start to pay principal as well. So as we get into next year, it becomes more of a strain on fast tracks finances to pay for the debt first, and then what's left over, they can pay it for operations. So the base system probably will end up subsidizing fast tracks in the future to keep it afloat. But currently, no, we're keeping those two pieces separate, fortunately.
Is it fair or too simplistic to say that when the base system subsidizes fast tracks, that essentially the bus network is subsidizing the rail network, even though the bus network is frankly more cost effective than the rail network is?
Yeah, for sure. When we back when fast tracks was first set up, it was obviously forecasted that we could generate enough sales taxes and fair revenue to pay for all of the fast tracks corridors to be completed. But we know now that that's not the case based on changes that have happened with sales taxes not growing as fast as what was projected back in 2004, as well as construction prices being significantly higher. So, yeah, I think you could say that technically it's all one system, interrelated. So our buses feed our fast track system. In fact, the one thing I didn't mention that fast tracks can pay for on the base system side was there was a provision in the original fast tracks plan that went to the voters that the fast tracks 6/10 could go to pay for a certain amount of increased bus service over on the base side, with the thought there being that there would have to be additional bus feeder service going to those rails. So fast tracks does subsidize base only to that extent. It's relatively small, about $20 million a year. And we call it rubber tire because it refers to the rubber tires on the buses, but your rubber tire service, that's what it is. But yeah, you could say that it is the base may end up subsidizing the rail service.
Yeah. Well, one other question, which again may or may not be a fair one to ask, but I've known this too. It really caught my attention when you mentioned it earlier. And that is, you said that fares contribute about 15% of the total revenue. And my understanding is that that's actually pretty low relative to other transit agencies around the country. And I wonder if, is that the case because RTD has high capital expenditures relative to its ridership? Are there other reasons for it? But I know, I follow this to some extent, and I don't know that it's always an apples to apples comparison, to be fair. But, I see other agencies that get 25, 30+% of their revenue from fare. If RTD did that, wow, we'd be in great financial shape, of course. And we are, frankly, talking about how our fares are too high, even though they're only contributing 15%. So can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, and what's interesting too is sometimes those other agencies, their funding is 20-25%, and they charge a lower fare than RTD. So generally what the difference is between us and those other agencies, so if you compare us to an MTA in New York City, they're very condensed in their service, relatively speaking, in their ridership. RTD has a 2,342 square mile service area, or that's the size of the district. We don't serve all corners, obviously, but because we're so large, and I believe we're the second largest transit agency in the United States in geographic terms. So our fares are distance-based, and they do seem expensive in that, yeah, it's one of the things we're going to look at from a fare rate perspective. But ours are really based on, so you could take a local route is $3. You could take that from one end of the district to the other district, jumping on different buses, basically, and cross many more miles generally than what the same fare would get you at a different system. Same with our regional fares. So because we have to cover such a large geographic area with our service, our costs are substantially higher as well per rider. So that's generally the reason why we have a big difference. All right. Any other questions? All righty.
Yeah, this is Joe again. I just was going to remind people that when the working group was started in 2018, one of the discussions with the consultants was about the impact of lower fares or higher fares on revenue. And at that time, we were told that the higher fare we wouldn't lose that many people, and the lower fare wouldn't really impact our number of people we got. So it was kind of a trade-off at that stage, is my understanding.
Definitely, good point. And yeah, those studies have really shown that the fares that we charge are inelastic. So, they don't have a huge impact on supply and demand, depending on how we change them. Now, obviously, if we change them to $10 for a local ride, we'd see a drop off in ridership. But generally speaking, changing 25 cents, 50 cents, maybe even $1 may not attract more riders if we lowered it, or dissuade other riders from using us just based on relatively small incremental changes. So yeah, they are fairly inelastic from that respect. But within those ridership groups, there's a lot of considerations when we talk about like our low income program, why we have discounted fares and trying to make things affordable for folks. And then part of the justification that we've used for, say, the airport fare, which is $10.50. The justification for that is the premium service. The equity analysis at the time showed that it wasn't adversely affecting our customers, other than for the fact that many of the workers out there who are minimum wage workers take that that line out to the airport. However, we offered alternatives in terms of employer passes through the EcoPass program, monthly passes, which are generally cheaper. So we definitely need to look at that whole structure, what the fare levels are we set going forward, and try to make them work for both the customers as well as RTD to help pay for our services.
So I've got one other question. I don't know if you get to it or not in this presentation, but it has to do with subsidies per route. And I know RTD looks at that. And I want to be clear that I understand that that's not the only thing you need to look at. You look at who you're serving and, you know, their needs and so on. But obviously subsidy per route gives you some indication of what's going on. And I've seen some of those numbers. One thing that's bothered me over the many years is that, well, besides the fact that, as we talked about before, our ridership data is a little bit squishy. Okay. And we also have never understood how we allocate EcoPass revenues across the lines. It doesn't make any sense to me. We seem to just allocate it kind of willy-nilly as opposed to what routes people are really taking. But on top of that, we never include capital. We don't seem to include capital. And so, for instance, if you could build a rail line for $200 million and you built another rail line for $2 billion, but they both had the same operating expenses and the same number of riders, they both look like they're subsidized the same. But common sense tells you that, of course, is not true. It can't be true. You're paying debt service on one of them. It's real money, right? It's real money that's going out the door. So again, I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that. This is probably not the time to go into great depth, but as we move ahead on both fare studies and on Reimagine, I think it's going to be important to get a better handle on understanding what really costs a lot to serve and what is a little less expensive to serve, and then try to figure out what on earth you do about it. But if you don't have the information, you can't even have the conversation.
Yeah, great point. And so the report that we put out once a year, we call it our service performance report. The last one we did was for 2019. We'll be coming out with the 2020 service performance report here shortly. What that does is it lays out, it shows by route, bus, rail, other services, how many riders that we had in the past year. It shows the allocated costs to each of those routes and the allocated fare revenue to each of those routes. So then it takes the difference between the revenues, fare revenues, and the costs, and that's the amount of subsidy that's needed to maintain that route. And you're absolutely right. So it swings pretty wildly. So if I took the extremes, if you were to look at the mall shuttle subsidy, so we have high ridership on the mall, we collect no fare, but because the ridership on the 16th Street Mall free shuttle is so voluminous, the cost to RTD is about 66 cents per rider. So that one, it's a little misleading because we don't collect fares, but it's a high volume service. So the other extreme is our paratransit service, where we do door-to-door service, dedicated rides. Our fares are limited to, it's 2 times by the federal government, 2 times the maximum that you can charge as an agency. So I think it's about $20 we can charge the customer. But the subsidized cost to that after taking out those fares is about $45 to $50 per customer. So there are some significant swings. And Matt, when we do take a portion of the capital costs and recognize it in that subsidy amount. And we do that by recognizing the depreciation in those expenses. So each year, if I have that 12-year bus, a bus with a 12-year useful life, and it costs $120,000, they cost a lot more than that. then I would recognize depreciation of $10,000 per year to recognize the wasting of that asset. That $10,000 is included in the operating expenses for that route. So we do include it, but to your point, we don't include those one-time large capital expenditures that we need to plan for going forward in state of good repair. We just recognize them after the fact as they come through operating expenses through depreciation.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, and I don't know what best practice is, but I think to get a better understanding, it really would be nice to include capital costs. And yes, I'm thinking of rail lines here, as well as the ongoing or the upcoming capital expenses, whether that's buses that need replacement or train lines that need replacement or train cars that need replacement. And if you really want to get an understanding of what it costs, I think that's important. And again, that does not give you the answer. It can't. Obviously, these things are going to cost different amounts, but I think it could be instructive in terms of trying to better set some priorities moving forward, as well as, frankly, just explaining to people that, yeah, it costs an awful lot of money to move people from A to B on certain routes. And okay, that this is why, and what if anything can we do about it? So I just always thought that was a bit of a missing element, shall we say. And again, I think with the FAIR study coming up and with Reimagine coming up, I think another look at that information, and I'll again include eco-passes in this, could be really, really helpful. And I don't know which way it would turn out. I mean, I don't know which is cheaper and which is more expensive. You can't just make a guess about that. You really need some decent data to understand it. So that's my request. I don't know if the RTD board has requested similar stuff or not, but I would hope as they get deeper into Reimagine, they might think about data like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think there will be a lot more focus on those types of analyses where we've been so focused in many of the recent years on build outs, opening new lines, that we really need to start taking a closer look at our operational costs and analyzing those. Our service planning department at RTD, that's how they determine what meets their service standards. So for instance, if something doesn't meet a certain production of riders, it would take less of a priority over, like a Route 15L where we have high ridership. So they try to evaluate our services from that service performance report and just ongoing data that they get on a daily and weekly as to how to best deploy our services based on the available resources that we have available to us. All right, I will move on unless anybody has anything else. So just wanted to kind of touch on a few of the challenges. So most of what I spoke to before really had to do with ongoing operations. And then we had COVID pay us a visit back in February. Mainly February is when we really started to see the impact of 2020. But as I mentioned, RTD, part of the Reimagine project that we're doing is really to take another look at RTD and the future of RTD and how should we organize it and what is our strategic plan going forward? Because we're really transitioning fast tracks from the capital expansion build out of all these large projects to operating them. So what's happened in the recent past is as fast tracks was built, and some of this debt is also on the base system, but RTD has a total of $3.9 billion in debt that goes out to 2050 that needs to be paid off. So that's one of the challenges we have is ongoing funding of that debt. So before we do anything else, we have to make our debt payments each year. Then we have also some state of good repair needs. So when I talk about state of good repair, it's maintaining our assets in what FTA, Federal Transit Administration, deems as a state of good repair. So that means not driving buses that are 20 years old, for instance, making sure that safety obviously is the #1 priority, but making sure that our infrastructure is well maintained. This whole state of good repair project came up a few years back when the FTA was looking at some of the older agencies like the MTA in New York, Chicago, some other areas where they've been funding their operations, but not maybe necessarily maintaining some of these really old assets, bridges, tunnels, rail lines, to a standard that they probably should have been. So it's created this big funding need. RTD isn't much different. However, we're a little bit newer in that respect. So we don't have such a big challenge, but we have state of good repairs needs over the next 6 years or so in the midterm financial plan of 250 to 300 million. Some of that is, a lot of that is backlogged state of repairs, and none of it has to do necessarily with safety, but it is things that we've needed to fix. We have some pits that our mechanics work in that are starting to crumble. We have lifts that need replacing that lift our buses up for maintenance, overhead cantilever wire on the rail systems that need replacing. So just maintaining the system is an ongoing cost. There really has been kind of the can has been kicked down the road in favor of ensuring that we got our new projects built out. So that's a big need that we have looming on the horizon. We have some remaining unfinished fast tracks corridors. We're still trying to identify funding for those. It's looking like some of those bigger projects won't be done, won't be even be able to be considered for the next 15 to 20 years when more money is available as debt is paid off and sales and use tax continue to grow. And then the final item I'd point out is RTD does have two pensions. One is for our represented employees. We have probably 2/3 of our employees are represented by the Amalgamated Transit Union, and the rest are what we refer to as non-represented employees that aren't affiliated with the union. So there's two pension plans. The pension plan on the union side is the bulk of that 285 million that it's underfunded. They have enough money to pay pensions, and RTD has a moral obligation to make sure that that pension plan stays funded, but it's $285 million in combination with the other pension plan underfunded. When you consider if it were 100% funded, it needs $285 million more. So that's another issue that we're grappling with. However, we do have a longer term plan to ensure that those retired employees do get their pensions. We were able to shift the pension on the non-represented employees over from a pension plan. So in 2008, any new employees after that were no longer in the pension plan. New employees are in what's more like a 401k type of plan. It's called a defined contribution plan, in which there's no guaranteed benefit. They're just contributions made by RTD. So we fixed some of those problems, but we still have a looming, fairly large liability out there. A couple other items that are important to mention is obviously we have a new general manager in Deborah Johnson. She just began in November. Prior to that, the last permanent CEO left in February of 2020. Then we had an interim CEO, general manager and CEO through November, from February through November, before General Manager Johnson came on board. So she's very experienced, very knowledgeable, but she's been here 6 months. So there's been a lot, she's been making a lot of positive changes, but I think there's going to be additional changes, including establishing a strategic direction going forward that she's already begun discussions with the board and the public about. That should culminate in the strategic direction in the July 2021 timeframe. And when I say strategic direction, it's really focusing on how do we want to, it aligns with the reimagine process. What is the future of RTD, and how do we want to focus our services and what we provide to the public? And then obviously we would align our budgets. Once those strategic priorities are identified, we would align our budget to meet those strategic priorities. A few slides here, I'm going to show you what happened with COVID. So basically started in January 19 timeframe with this graph, and it shows we're trucking along about 8 to 10,000 riders, 8 to 10 million riders per month, all the way up until you get to the January, February timeframe, and then you can see it drop off significantly. So we've seen about a 60 to 65% drop in our ridership due to COVID. A lot of remote workers, a lot of people not wanting to take transit due to health concerns, et cetera. So we've seen just a small uptick there in March of 21, and we're going to get the April numbers soon. But as was mentioned early on, nobody knows what the future of ridership is, what the economic landscape is going to look like in terms of, are people going to need to commute to work? Will students go back to schools? We have fairly large ridership populations from those two groups. Just what will that look like? So along with that decline in ridership, we also experienced the decline in fare revenue, of course. So got some numbers here, and they're fairly stark. So in 2019, we collected $154 million in fare revenue. In 2020, and keep in mind that 2020 had 10 months of the COVID impact from basically March through December. So we had 2 normal months, but we still saw a decrease of about $78 million in fare revenue from the prior year. So far through March 2021, if we take our results for fare revenues and analyze them, you're looking at about a $53 million fare revenue collection in 2021 versus $154 million just 2 years ago. So there's about a $100 million decrease in our recurring ongoing revenues if things don't improve. On the sales tax side, we've actually been very, very fortunate. So part of this, we think, is due to the stimulus spending that's, we've had these stimulus checks go out to individuals. We've had supplemental unemployment benefits paid by the federal government that's allowed people to continue to spend, generate sales and use taxes for RTD. So you can see there's a dip in our sales taxes February and March of 2020, and then they've recovered. So what we saw in 2020 was a 4.1% decrease in our sales and use taxes, and we collect about a little over $600 million in average year in sales and use taxes. So that decrease equated to about $27 million. Fortunately, we have already seen those numbers get back to normal. So they're actually back on track with what we forecasted pre-COVID. They're just a little bit short. So in 2019, we had forecasted that we would collect $690 million in sales and use taxes in 2021. The most recent forecast is showing 683. So we're pretty darn close to back where we thought we would be at this point in time, which is very fortunate for us. The federal government issued 3 different COVID funding relief packages, and these weren't just for transit, but transit was appropriated certain amounts to the Department of Transportation. RTD's apportionments for each one of those fundings is a total of about $774 million. So you can see in those sub bullets there, there's the CARES Act that was awarded in 2020, the CRISA Act that was awarded in January 2021, followed by the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, in March of 2021. So RTD has used all of the already drawn the $232 million CARES Act to sustain operations during COVID in 2020. The $203 million with CRISA has already been designated to sustain our current operations due to the loss in revenue, fare revenue particularly, that we're experiencing. And that's designated to sustain operations at approximately an 80 to 85% of pre-COVID levels through the next 2 years. And then we have the ARPA funding on top of that. We're still awaiting guidance on how that funding can be used, but generally what the guidance is it has to be used the same way as the CRISA and CARES funding, and that's to sustain operations. So nobody really knows what's going to happen with transit going forward. We don't know what our revenues are going to look like, but we do have this funding that's keeping us in business and allowing us to move our customers continually, even though we've had to reduce quite a bit of service just to match up with our revenues. You know, I should mention that when the ARPA funding came out, that guidance on that was it can be drawn all the way through 2024. So these are all grants in which we incur the expenditures first. So we pay our drivers, our operators, our mechanics, purchase transportation, we pay those first. Then we go and we can draw the funding from the grants that have been apportioned to us. So with the ARPA guidance, they said, hey, you know, you've got to you can draw through 2024 on the ARPA funding. So to me, that indicates that the FTA is saying, hey, there's probably not going to be any more funding coming for RTD or others. So try to stretch what you do have apportioned to you out through 2024. And then we're getting to the end here. This is just kind of a quick comparison. So if we had not gotten those 3 grants, those 3 COVID relief grants in the prior slide, the top graph shows what that would look like in terms of RTD's finances, with the blue bar being our revenues and the orange bar being our expenses. You can see in each year that our expenses far exceed our revenues. So that was definitely non-sustainable. And by the way, this period that we're showing here is basically 2019 using actual numbers, as well as 2020, and then 2021 through 2026 is our normal midterm financial plan period. So that's our 6-year forecast. So without that funding, we would have been in trouble and had to cut a lot more in terms of expenses, and that mainly comes from service. Like I said, we're committed to our debt, so we can't really change that. The debt service payments. The next largest expenditure is providing operational services. And so we would have to cut back even further than where we are currently with providing service. The second graph shows what the 3 COVID relief funding measures have done for us. It's brought our revenues up above expenditures. You can see up through 2024, revenues exceed expenditures in each year. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw those grants as quickly as possible so we can get the money in the bank and start earning interest. But then what happens is after 2024, that funding kind of falls off. There's no more after that we're aware of at this point. So then our revenues return to being less than expenses in 25, 26 and beyond. So depending on what happens with the future of transit, if riders return, if fare revenue returns and we get back to normal, that could be a little bit different picture, but we do have some challenges out in the future financially if the money runs out and transit takes a completely different financial look than it has in the past pre-COVID. So I just summarize up here with these bullet points what we just discussed. Some of the other challenges that we have are in that third bullet point. One of the big challenges that we've had in recent years is recruiting employees and retaining them. We are chronically understaffed in our operators and mechanics and some other areas, but we have a really difficult time recruiting and retaining employees. So one of the things that we've talked about with Reimagine is aligning our resources, or aligning our operations with the resources that we can provide, not just financially, but also in terms of human talent. So that may come into play. And then we also have the state of good repair challenges, that $250 to $300 million issue. That's something that we'll have to address before our assets start falling apart. And then, another consideration is the changing landscape in that final bullet of transit itself. There's obviously been a lot of new services, transit services coming into the fold, such as Uber, Lyft. There's ride sharing. Vanpool's been around a while, but there's a lot of complementary services to transit that address the first and last mile, or they also are, for lack of a better term, competitors. So we need to work on how we ensure transit meets the needs of our constituents while kind of meshing with this new paradigm of how people get around, whether they're working from home, et cetera. So those are some of the considerations that go into our strategic planning process that we're undertaking currently. And I believe that is all. So I'd like to open it up to any questions you might have.
Questions? Very comprehensive overview. Hopefully that was what folks were looking for.
Yeah, that was great, Doug. It was extremely useful. Are some of the reports, I haven't looked recently, but you mentioned the one I was interested in to some extent about the cost per route. Is all of that on the RTD's website? Is that easily accessible?
Yeah, it's a little tough to find. So let me send that to Roger to distribute if that's okay, Matt.
Okay. Yeah, I've spent some time wandering through the website, which has its problems. Let's put it that way.
Agreed. In our attempts to be transparent, we've put so much information out there, it's hard to find it and it's hard to understand. And so one of the things that we're undertaking, and this is one of the accountability committee recommendations, is to have a more user-friendly website where we can communicate financial issues, statistical issues in a more user-friendly format and more accessible format, so you don't have to hunt and peck for what you're looking for. So that's on the horizon too.
Yeah, Roger, you got your hand up?
Yeah, Doug, do you see any change in funding coming because of a Democratic administration in Washington rather than the Republicans?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, one of the things that was raised, I think the Biden administration first began speaking to it was about a month ago, was a large infrastructure package. So it's very possible that obviously we'd have to go through the House and the Senate, money appropriated for that. So it's possible if that were to move forward that RTD could receive some funding. The initial indications from what the Biden administration indicated was that funding would primarily be not for operations, but for more state of good repair type issues and infrastructure spending. So that would be super beneficial to RTD if we could get some of that money to do some state of good repair fixes that we need.
I just wanted to ask if we could get a copy of the presentation today. I don't think we have one yet, the PowerPoint. It's very helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It was a very useful presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, good.
Ed, you have a question?
Yeah, so I will preface this with saying I'm learning a lot. I'm one of the newer people on this committee. So bear with me when I ask this question. I also connect just about everything to the experience of writing. Okay, so I'm going to state an observation and ask you if there are any connections to the fiscal side of things. And if there aren't, then I'll accept that and I'll bring it up in another discussion.
Okay.
Pre-pandemic, I would, on my way home, I always ride light rail. I'm happy to support it. I moved out here from the East Coast where I relied on it in New York City and then in Washington, D.C. So coming out here, if I could use it, I wanted to. And I do that every day. On my way home from work, I take the train starting at the convention center area. Sometimes, frequently, I would have to wait about 45 minutes to get a train that wasn't jam-packed with people. And I'm comfortable after living in New York City. I can handle being packed into a train, but there literally is no room. And so I start wondering, as a writer, why that is. Why are there not more frequent trains? And what is the effect on getting more people to buy into public transit here, to use it? If they see trains like that, why would they start using it? Why would they give up a car? And then it turns into my commute is much longer than driving to downtown to where I work from where I live. And I'm just curious, as a new person to this group, what are the fiscal components of that just for the average writer? Like, what can someone know? What could I share with people about that experience to kind of get them to buy in if they might be waiting that long?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I take the train too. So I take it from Lincoln down south all the way downtown. And so I run into those same issues, right? With I try to get on at a stop earlier so I can find a seat.
Yeah.
What you're talking about. But fortunately with trains, there's not a huge cost to adding another car to a train, for instance, because we already have the operator, we're already using the electricity. It costs a little bit more to add the train. What we're constrained by generally is the system itself. So you can imagine we have all these routes and trains going through, and so they all have to be timed, and we have to match up the bus routes with that. Doesn't mean we can't change it. But yeah, peak service is a lot different than if you write it in the middle of the day, for instance. So our service planning folks are constantly trying to adjust to those demands. And so they'll drop a car off a train, so we're not pulling an extra car during the middle of the day, then they'll add it back for rush hour. But yeah, it's a real challenge, and a lot of it has to do with the timing of the trains. The platforms themselves can only take up to 4 cars in a train. At DUS, we call it the throat, where everybody comes in. There's shared tracks where all these trains have to come in and share tracks. So there's those kinds of constraints where it doesn't lend itself to a lot of expansion currently. So we're constantly looking, how can we supplement service, do more frequent trains, that type of thing. The other constraint that we have is our human resource constraint with operators, finding enough operators. Sometimes if there's a train that doesn't show up, it's usually for that reason, because somebody called out sick and we don't have anybody to run the train. So a lot of limitations, and definitely we try to put out the service so you don't have to cram in like in New York City, but we like everybody to have a seat if possible, but usually that's not the case.
And the other thing, and maybe this definitely is for another area, not a fiscal issue, I started wondering if there was any connection, any work with RTD and different major employers in a certain area, if there are bottlenecks, to offer kind of tapered hours and flexibility in work schedules, so that the rush hour is not so many people at once, that if there could be different start and stop times for work, that helps with not put all the pressure on RTD to make it work for everyone. Because I think that large employers could have a positive impact on that as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And staggering, I guess.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. And to a certain extent, if those large employers allow, at least continue to allow partial remote work from home, even if it's a couple days a week, that could help substantially. What we see, why we have the hours that we do. So we basically run our buses and trains mainly the trains from, I believe I want to say 4 o'clock in the morning till 2 o'clock the next morning. We have a lot of workers that work restaurants, work bars, things like that need to get home. So we do try to cover all that service. And yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, it's tough for us to get them to do that. It would be nice if they would. But we have first, second, and third shift workers that use our service throughout the day. But you're right, there's just a glut of them during rush hour, the typical rush hour. I kind of see the whole standard 8 to 5 workday changing a bit, especially after COVID. So maybe that will help.
Hey, Ben,
Hi, this is Kit.
wait, hang on. A whole bunch of people have had their hands up for quite a while.
And Ben is next, Matt.
Yeah, I know, Ben is next.
And then Joan, and then Travis, and then David.
Yep.
Okay, Doug, I know in this environment in particular, forecasting is really difficult and problematic, but don't you guys contract with the lead school to do a lot of that work for you? And maybe you could, I know we've been going on a long time, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what they do for you and how they do it, because I think that's impactful for how you set your numbers in the future.
Yeah, great point. So back in 2010, the RTD board and staff recommended to the RTD board that we go outside of RTD and try to get more specific expertise to help forecast our sales and use taxes. So the state of Colorado has their own office, the Office of State Planning and Budgeting, and then there's another one that I can never remember the name of. There's 2 agencies that just specialize in doing that. Prior to 2010, RTD was doing that all in-house with limited success. And part of that recommendation stemmed from the 2004 finance plan for fast tracks. So by 2010, we realized, hey, sales taxes aren't coming in like the fast tracks plan had anticipated. So we need some economic expertise that we don't have in-house. We went out and put out an RFP for a sales and use tax forecasting firm, and the University of Colorado Lead School of Business, their economics department. They call it the Business Research Division, is who we contracted with, and we've contracted with them ever since. They provide us our forecasts, and they provide them for that budget year, the midterm financial plan 6-year, and then the 30-year plan. So they do give us numbers. So we do rely on their expertise for that, which is immensely helpful. What they don't give us, and what no forecaster I've ever seen commit to, is forecasting recessions or a pandemic, because it's virtually impossible. So essentially what their forecasts are built on are historical collections, and then they incorporate additional data based on Moody's also does a large forecast. They take into consideration what's going on in the Denver metro area with employment, personal income, those types of things. So they really go into an in-depth analysis. They have this very sophisticated model, and they provide the numbers to us. They've been very successful. Most years they're only off by less than 1% from what our actuals are only 1% less than what they forecasted. Where it gets dicey is when the further you go out in the future, the less certain it becomes. So we do have that going for us, and it's very helpful because our sales and use taxes are such a large part of our revenue.
Thanks.
All right, I think Joan was next.
Hi guys, can you hear me okay? I'm actually driving right now, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Also, congrats, Doug, on the promotion. I don't even know if you'll remember me, but I actually interviewed you for my graduate thesis many years ago. So first and foremost, I wanted to say that. You remember, that's good. Okay, so.
Thank you. Yeah, we had coffee.
Yes, at I think we were at Starbucks actually on 16th. Anywho, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the e-trip process and some of the stuff that's been going on financially with e-trip and some of the discussions, which Kit might actually be bringing some of that up as well. And I just wanted to check in and see if you and the finance team had kind of talked with people at CDOT as well as CDPHE with some of the non-compliance options that they're exploring in that rulemaking process. I know that they're considering the idea of maybe businesses that don't comply with this regulation, maybe creating programs or supporting programs like RTD services or other products that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I was just curious if you guys had the conversation, because I think that it'll definitely potentially increase revenue for the agency.
It's a good question, Joan. And I think you're referring to the governor would like businesses to reduce the number of commuters when you say e-trip, is that right?
Yes, correct. So it's the employer traffic reduction program that they're discussing. So e-trip is the acronym. Oh,
good. Thank you for that. And we've only had just kind of cursory discussions about it thus far, only from the standpoint of, hey, that could really increase our ridership. Obviously that would be good to a certain extent, other than it depends on how much that ridership increases. So to Danny's point, if everybody starts commuting and not taking their cars during rush hour, we're not going to have enough vehicles to move those folks. So there's definitely associated costs. The more efficient we can be with more riders on the existing routes that we have, the better off we are financially. But so for instance, if we offered free fares, we anticipate that would really increase our ridership and actually cost us more money just because we'd have to add additional service. But no, we haven't had really in-depth discussions about that yet. We're kind of waiting to see what form that takes and how, if it's even possible. It sounds like there's already quite a bit of pushback from the private sector on, what they can and can't do. So, but it would be interesting to see how that materializes.
Right,
yeah,
so
absolutely. And I can definitely loop you in a little bit further on the discussion. Sorry, Matt.
No, that's okay. I'm just trying to make sure we have enough time. Travis, you have your hand up, David, and then there was somebody on the phone, I don't know who also had a comment. If anybody else has a question, please raise your virtual hand and we'll get to you. So Travis?
Yeah, Doug, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, has RTD looked at other sources of revenue? Like Tabor limits you on taxes, but a lot of government agencies seem to be going after fees or other ways that you can like collect money without being impacted by Tabor, and sort of like what would that look like for RTD if it was something got pursued in the future?
We have looked at other possible revenue sources back in 2010. So in 2008, 2009, there was the Great Recession. We saw a fairly sizable dip of about 10% in our sales and use taxes. So that was kind of painful for us at the time. And we didn't really have a very strong fiscal policy. So we formed a fiscal sustainability committee, which mainly consisted of folks with expertise outside of RTD to look at those kinds of issues. What could we do to adjust revenues and expenses? One of those items being what could we do to generate additional revenues? And we have been looking at different options over the years. We discussed earlier with Bill Soroy the legislation that would allow us to charge for parking, which would be considered a fee. There's obviously challenges with that because it looks like a fare increase, like a back-end fare increase almost, right? So if I drive to a park and ride, instead of paying my $3, now I have to pay $3 plus parking if I'm a resident. So there's some challenges, but definitely worth considering. We've looked at other options. So in that legislation as well, in RTD's enabling legislation, we can actually charge mills for property taxes. We just have not. So we do have that capability. We'd have to go to the voters, of course, because it's a tax increase. But yeah, definitely some of those things would definitely help. The other side of the equation, obviously, is the cost side, looking at efficiencies, what we can do better, how we can maintain our system better, placing services where the demand is most needed, and maybe eliminating other services if nobody's using it, and possibly providing alternatives, such as a voucher for another service. So definitely all those things are on the table. It's just there's political implications, there's voter approval, it's a longer term process, but it's definitely fair game.
Makes sense. Thank you.
David?
Thanks, Matt. And my question is along the lines of what Travis asked, but I guess I'll clarify something in asking my question. So your financial challenges summary slide, my back of envelope addition of your liabilities between debt, the fast tracks, unfinished corridors, state of good repair, and so on, looks like it's totaling to about $6.5 to $7 billion, somewhere in that range. What were the accountability committee's recommendations for handling that kind of liability?
The accountability committee has been meeting, I think about 6 months now. They are supposed to come out with their final recommendations at the end of June. We're expecting them on July 1st, and we have 45 days to respond. Some of the initial recommendations, the draft recommendations that I've seen they recognize that there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do about the debt. And what we do internally is we're constantly looking at that debt and how we can restructure it if needed. So most recently, we refinanced 2 of our large debt issues. The most notable one we refinanced in March. It was bonds that we had issued back in 2012 for fast tracks. Interest rates had dropped enough that we were able to refinance that debt and save $127 million. So that was very helpful. And we were able to structure it so we could bring all of the savings forward into the next 3 to 4 years. So we always look for opportunities like that. As far as the accountability committee goes, there's nothing, it's almost as if they've done what we've done, said, hey, we have to pay this. We can try to, manage it the best we can, but until we pay it off. One of their recommendations, though, now that I think about it, was to try to pay off the debt more quickly. We can prepay the debt if we have funding available. If we can pay that debt down sooner, their recommendation is pay the debt down sooner. That might free up some future monies to finish the additional corridors. So obviously a trade-off, we pay it off sooner. There's less money for other things, et cetera. But yeah, it's a huge bogey for us.
Thank you.
Hey, David, I did that math too, but it was such a big number, I didn't want to raise it. But I'm I'm glad you did, actually, because it does remind us of, what's really out there in the long run. Okay, there was somebody on the telephone who had a question.
Yes, this is Catherine Sanders. And Chair, if you wouldn't mind in the future, if someone interjects by phone, I can't see who's raised their hand, and I also cannot raise my hand. So if you would just collect my name and then put me in line, I'm happy to be called on. I don't want to cut other people off, but I don't have access to the tools that help a Zoom meeting run smoothly. And that has to do with being, here with children right now. So I would just appreciate that in future. Joan is correct. I was going to just simply interject about the E-trip process. I was also going to bring up that when it comes to flex schedules, a lot of times people have access to a flex schedule, but they're unable to use it because they're caring for children. Across the board, when we survey employees, the most, expected or consistent statistics that we receive is 20% of the workforce is caring for children and is needing to transport children either to daycare or to a school. So some of that flexibility, it's beneficial if there is a flex schedule policy, and that's going to be a part of this E-trip, but it's not going to solve the whole problem, especially with the school choice system. Now, Doug, I really appreciate your presentation. It was incredibly thorough and detailed, and I learned a lot. It's difficult to try to communicate this level of detail to the general public. And I was glad to hear that the accountability committee was raising the transparency of the entire financial process as a to-do for RTD. Is there a timeline on when those kind of resources will be developed? Or is there a way that you would recommend trying to initially just educate people about the complexities of the problem?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine.
And that's the end of my question.
Thank you. Yeah, great point. And time frame wise, so we probably, under Deborah's direction, we probably would have done something a little sooner than waiting for the July recommendations. One of our stumbling blocks is that we're a little reluctant to put too much out there until we set a strategic direction, because part of that strategic direction also involves identifying which factors we want to measure our success with, whether that's ridership, on-time performance, other measures. So that's been one of the reasons why we haven't put anything out there. But in the next 2 months, what I would like to do, and I need to talk to General Manager Johnson about this, is some of the information isn't necessarily affected by our strategic direction. It's just general information, like our budget, for instance. I think we could do a better job. And what I'm envisioning and I think this is what the accountability committee is going to recommend, is on our website, is have things like pie charts and graphs. It's just really easy to understand, maybe bullet points at a high level to talk about our budget process. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking at, instead of spreadsheets and 20-page narratives, just to communicate in layman's terms, what our financial stature is and what our challenges are. So that's definitely on my plate, and we anticipate getting that out in the next couple months. I just got to get the go ahead from my boss.
That's understandable. And yeah, if you wouldn't mind just sharing it back with this group, we like to make sure that the north area that we cover is well informed. And I wanted to mention, since you brought up graphic communication, when the past program working group, working off the top of my memory, when that was happening and they were going about doing these public meetings, I saw some really nice graphics to communicate the problem in a very easy to digest way. So if you guys have any of those graphics, and that might be another way of trying to communicate. Of course, that was specific with passes and with fares as well. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, and I'll definitely take a look at that, because one of our things is coming from financial department. We're always trying to communicate information from our perspective. But yeah, it's really helpful for us to know what the general public would like to see. And that was going to be part of the process too, as we develop these communications, is what's most valuable and in what format. Are you more of a visual person? Would you rather see graphs and charts, or would you rather see trend lines and numbers, that kind of thing? So that's definitely going to be part of our process. So we won't just throw something out there that we think works, we want it to be usable for the reader.
And thanks, Catherine, for reminding us about people on the phone. I did, by the way, put you in line right after the people who'd already raised their hands virtually. So I tried my best, but thanks for reminding us. It's tough when you're on the phone.
I'll jump in also and let you know if you press *9 on your phone, it'll raise your hand for you. And I'll try to remember to mention that, because I always forget about that when I'm starting these calls up.
Cool, I didn't know that. That's a great feature.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have a quick question or comment on this? We're just about at the end of our time. Okay, well, Doug, thank you so much. You went over with us. I am sure we're going to have more questions for you, because we like counting the money and seeing what we can do with it. And it's such a critical piece of it. But thanks so much for getting all of us up to speed. We will, when we have a chance as a group, I think, talk about this some more. And if we have any more questions, I'm sure Roger can get them to you. And if you can get us some of that information, that would be great. And God, if you can make the RTD website more accessible, I would be very thankful.
Agreed. I totally agree. No, thank all of you for your service, and thank you for the questions and your interest. And certainly, if there's any questions, Roger can pass them on. I'm available anytime to just let me know. And thanks again for inviting me.
Thanks so much. Roger.
I was going to go into some, have us have some conversation about the takeaways and kind of next steps. I think what I'd suggest, Matt and Joanna, is when we talk about the agenda for next month, maybe, one of the items was finding and setting aside time for discussion about, items. So I think we'll push that to that time. I sent the summary out. I meant to send it out earlier. I kind of highlighted some areas that I thought really jumped out where we might want to work on those particular items. But we can have a discussion and make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, I think we can do that next time. And also, while it's fresh in people's minds, today's conversations, you might jot down some things that we talk as a group about next time, some stuff we want to follow up on, some additional questions we have, anything we might want to pass on to the RTD board, et cetera. It's kind of our grand opportunity to do that. Don't have time today, and I suspect people are tired of this anyway right now. But yeah, let's do that next time for sure.
The only other thing is just to let you know that I will be on vacation for the June meeting. So my colleague at CRL, Nathan, will be firing up the Zoom call, and he's also going to join us on our agenda planning call, so that he'll be up to speed on what we're going to talk about.
I don't remember giving you permission to go on vacation, Roger.
I'm so sorry about that.
Hey, Roger, I have a technical question for you.
You bet.
For our upcoming meetings, are you able with your Zoom level to enable reactions for us? That would also allow us to use the raise your hand function. I was so happy that so many of us had questions and comments for Doug today. It would also be helpful if you can enable that we could use that to use the raise your hand function, so that even the people on the call, we could just do that and wait for you to call on us, or whoever else facilitates.
Raise your hand is enabled.
Yeah, it's down there at the bottom on the far right.
I don't have that. Yeah.
That's who I was calling on. I watched as people raise their hands, and I tried in that order as best I could. So obviously most people found.
I'll poke around and we'll see if we can figure out why that's not showing up on your screen, because yeah, we did. It is enabled.
Okay, yeah, and I don't have it. If I click on the ellipsis by my name, it doesn't have it there either.
Go
So
down to the bottom of your screen
Mhm.
and look at the icons at the bottom, very bottom of the screen. There's a chat function and then a raise hand function.
Mm-mm.
It depends on what you're come in on, but if you click on the
Yeah.
ellipses, I think one of them says reactions or something like that. No? Well, it should.
This is Nancy, and I don't have any of that either. And it
Yeah.
says chat is disabled.
Yeah, chat is disabled. So I couldn't type in, I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
I think it's disabled on your end rather than universally. So you need to look at, well, if the rest of us
Yeah.
have it and you don't, I think it's something that must be the way you have your Zoom set up. So just go to settings and look at how you've got your settings done.
My chat is disabled and I've been
Yeah.
in several Zooms and chat works fine in the other ones.
Yeah, and I use the same account to teach for my university, and it's always in my, like, whoever runs it can control those, and
Yes.
it should be universal. So
I don't know what's going on. I'll take a look, and it is weird that some have chat, some have raised hands. So let me go see what I can do. I
Okay,
appreciate you
great.
pointing it out.
Yeah, and it's been that way in past meetings. Like I remember last one too.
So weird.
I was going to type in chat has always been disabled for me when I join these.
We're just excluding you, Danny.
That's okay. That's okay.
All right.
Not so okay.
Raise your hand.
I know, that's what I did. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, I will get working on that.
Thank you so much.
All right. Everyone have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Roger.
Have a good meeting today.
Very good meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.